Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us again at the British in India. A special welcome to those from different time zones, and particularly to tonight's speakers, one of whom, of course, coming from Tucson, is in a different time zone. Professor Richard Eaton of the University of Arizona is the leading historian of medieval India. His publications illustrate this. Monographs on the Sufis in the Indian Sultanate of Bijapur, on the growth of Islam in Bengal, and on the social history of the Deccan were followed more recently by India in the Persianate Age, the second volume of the Penguin New History of India, and an international bestseller. India in the Persianate Age has reversed the idea of Indian history before the British period as a period of intellectual stagnancy and decline by revealing its 7 centuries of intense engagement with the Persian world, which by then embraced much of Central Asia, Afghanistan, and eventually India itself. Richard's dual focus on India and the Persianate world has autobiographical origins. Many of us here have ancestral connections with India. Richard's are with Iran. His great-grandfather was a missionary there for 20 years. His parents were medical missionaries in the 1950s and 60s, and Richard himself spent 2 years in Iran with the Peace Corps. As he puts it, his emotional attachment is to Iran, his intellectual attachment to India. Richard has been sharing his account of India in the Persianate Age with audiences worldwide through Zoom, and as a descendant of British India who knew nothing or hardly anything of India's prior history, his talks, not to mention his PowerPoint, his brilliant PowerPoints, were positively revelatory. I stalked Richard around YouTube, thinking I could fix more in my mind through repetition. And a webinar to students at a Delhi university provided not only an elusive fact, but the rationale for tonight's lecture. It was a student's question about where the British fitted in, which you answered, Richard, along the lines of the British were in the background and there they should stay. Well, of course, they weren't in the background post-1765, and I knew, if not why, that there was serious engagement by East India Company officials with Persian culture in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Sir William Jones was but one, and that this must have endured throughout the British period, which may have been why my grandfather, a district officer in the United Provinces from before the First World War to 1947, was required to learn Persian. I emailed Richard saying I'd like to include a lecture on the Persianate world and India, and also touch on how the British engaged with Persianate culture later. And he agreed to share the Zoom rostrum with Dr. Rosie Llewellyn-Jones. Rosie is well known in the UK and India as a historian of the colonial period, and in William Dalrymple's words, the greatest living authority on Nawabi Lucknow. Her doctoral thesis at SOAS was published as A Fatal Friendship, the Nawabs, the British, and the City of Lucknow, and she has written inter alia biographies of Wajid Ali Shah, King of Awadh, and of Major General Claude Martin, East India Company magnate and philanthropist, also of Lucknow, and recent works on the uprising of 1857, 2 of that name, and Battlefield Lucknow, forthcoming this year from HarperCollins, India. Rosie's 40-year contribution to the conservation of European graveyards in South Asia through the British Association for Cemeteries in South Asia is well known, and she was, until recently, archivist at the Royal Society for Asian Affairs in London and a council member of the Royal Asiatic Society, learned societies, many of whose members are here tonight, that manifest the enduring connection of the British with Central and South Asia. No one more fitting to take Richard's account of the impact of Persianate culture on India into the following period. The format of tonight's lecture is that Richard will talk for 40 minutes, followed by Rosie for 20. Please key any questions into the chat box, and I shall read them out to Richard and Rosie after their talks. Richard, the Zoom rostrum is now yours.
Well, thank you very much, Valerie, for that very generous introduction. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be with you today. The talk I'm giving is a product of a great deal of thinking over the years about the long history of the relations between Iran and India, between Persianate culture and Sanskrit culture, and so forth. And so the Persianate world and India's place in it is the subject of the book I recently wrote. That's true, but it needs a little more explication, I think, here in terms of understanding the word and how it became so prominent, especially recently in academic discourse. So what it is, the word Persianate itself, I'm simply using, it's essentially an adjectival construction referring to this wide range of culture derived from the canon, Persian canon. And it's analogous, therefore, with words like Latinate or Italianate, Germanic, Hellenic, Hispanic, and many others. So you start with a language, moving to the canon, and then to the broader culture that is associated with that canon. So the Persianate world, therefore, I understand as you see here, an integrated sense of moral, social, political, and aesthetic order informed by the circulation of Persian texts considered prestigious and normative. In other words, a canon, which circulated from the Balkans to Bengal between the 9th and the 19th century. So if we look at it geographically, this is kind of what we're talking about in this long 1,000-year period of time. When we think of the Persian world, the Persian language, since it is the national language of Iran, Iran, as you see from this map, is actually only a remnant of what was actually a much larger world. And this is what I need to talk about now, is something about how this world came into being, its origins. Well, one can think of it in the easiest way of thinking about it, perhaps, is it's a consequence of both political and a socio-linguistic process that was triggered in the mid-7th century when Arab armies overthrew the Sasanian Empire, which ruled between the 3rd and the 7th century, swiftly annexing the former territories of that empire in Iraq, the Iranian Plateau, in Khorasan, and in Central Asia. Arab caliphs instated Arabic for administration, literature, education, and so forth, which submerged the region's Iranian languages, including Middle Persian, which had been the official language of the Sasanian Empire, which you see here on the map. But then in the 8th century, a revolution that was led largely by Arabized Persian speakers in the eastern section of the empire, in Khorasan, in Central Asia, launched a new dynasty, established a new city in the mid-8th century, Baghdad. And this capital was located only 16 miles northwest of the ancient capital of the Samanid dynasty, the Sasanian dynasty of Persia. That is Ctesiphon. And here we see the great imperial palace of the Sasanian Persians, only 16 miles from modern Baghdad. That's important because it meant that Baghdad inherited a good deal of the pre-Islamic heritage of Sasanian Iran. At the same time, there was a quiet linguistic revolution that was occurring in Central Asia, and it was a direct outcome of the conquest of Iran by the Arabs in the mid-7th century. The Battle of Nehawand overthrew the Sasanian dynasty. But what's interesting is that Arabic was imposed on the Iranian plateau, and over a period of about 300 years, Middle Persian, which had been the language of the Sasanians, merged with Arabic, adopted the Arabic script, a great deal of Arabic vocabulary, so that we have essentially modern Persian or New Persian emerging as a literary force roughly 300 years after the conquest. And then after another 250 years after the first kind of earliest poetry, I'm citing Rudaki here in the 10th century. Then we get in the 13th century the beginning of classical literature, which is so renowned today throughout the Persian-speaking world. Nizami, I'm only citing one among many in the early 13th century. What's interesting is that the evolution of modern Persian has a striking parallel with that of modern English, where we have, again, an important battle that all of you folks know about, Battle of Hastings in 1066, after which French merges and mixes with Anglo-Saxon. Another 300 years after the conquest, you have Chaucer, and then another 250 years after that, you have classical English. I'm citing only Shakespeare, but the parallel is what I think is what's most fascinating, and how a military conquest has enormous consequences, both linguistic and ultimately literary. And that's the point, that the rise of New Persian and its flourishing some 500 years after the initial conquest is the story we're telling here. So here's a map then of the Samanid Empire as it existed in the 9th and 10th centuries. And this was the state, the Samanids, that patronized this new language. So this is where New Persian kind of was incubated in the 10th and the 9th and 10th centuries. It became the official medium language, the official language of bureaucracy by the Samanids. And so we asked the question then, why Persian survived? Well, partly the answer lies in the fact that Persian, this New Persian, was not identified with any kind of religious liturgy or ritual that might have posed a challenge to Arabic, which of course was the language of Islam. So unlike Coptic or Aramaic or Syriac, all of which either disappeared or vastly shrank in their usage or geographic reach, Persian flourished. It was really a secular language in many senses. Nor was Persian identified with an ethnic group, unlike Arabic or, for example, Turkish. The word for Persian was simply Farsi, which referred to a region in Iran, but not an ethnic community. Or Dardi, as is still used in Afghanistan, simply meant the court. So it did not refer to an ethnic group. So here we see it then in Central Asia, incubated in the Samanid state, its capital at Bukhara. Bukhara was on the Silk Road between China and the Mediterranean, as well as very important trade routes connecting Central Asia with India. It was an extremely cosmopolitan city in the 9th and 10th centuries, with Zoroastrians, Christians, Manichaeans, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, and multilingual. Turkish, Arabic, Sogdian was all spoken, as well as New Persian. But New Persian became the common denominator. As I said, it was a language that was patronized by the court. It was one of the earliest courts to patronize New Persian. It ultimately eclipsed Arabic for a number of reasons. One was that Arabic had no tradition of imperial rule. The Arab tribes had come out of the Arabian Peninsula, whereas Persian had a long tradition of imperial rule, so that it was very easy for Baghdad, so close to Ctesiphon, the old capital of the Sasanians, to employ Persian writers who knew statecraft, who had written discourses on political thought. Persian also had a tradition of epic literature, which might enable people to imagine a trans-regional political space, unlike Arabic. And most importantly, Persian had a tradition of a service class of writers, professional writers who managed the records, both bureaucratic and administrative machinery, for 1,000 years. This class of professional writers was used by successive dynasties of the Iranian plateau, so that each new empire would recruit the writers from its predecessor. So it's not surprising that the Arabs recruited Persian speakers who knew Arabic to run the new Abbasid Empire. So for these reasons, Persian was able to survive. Plus, very importantly, the advent of the paper technology, the making of paper, arrived from China right about the time that the Samanid state was evolving. And paper, of course, facilitated the transfer of, as a technology of knowledge, of Persian across space. So Persian really emerged as a new language at the very time that the technology of writing and knowledge transmission was facilitated by this radical new invention, paper. So this all leads us then to the formation of a literary canon, assisted by paper, assisted by the idea that Persian storytellers and literati were circulating from court to court. The Samanids were not the only Persian using court. There are many others in Central Asia. And each court wanted to employ the kind of stars of Persian poetry and literature. And of course, the poets themselves and literati needed employment. So there was a natural convergence of these new states and the patronage of Persian using poets and literati. We can think of network theory as a way of conceptualizing what's going on here, with each dot representing a court or a site for the production of Persian language, Persian literature, and the lines between them representing the circulation of people and of texts between them. So this idea really, I think, projects the idea of a trans-regional zone. It had nothing to do with politics. It skips over political boundaries very easily, because, to the extent that Persian now becomes a trans-regional phenomenon. One of the successor states to the Samanids was the Ghazabid Empire. And the Ghazabids were founded by people who revolted against their Samanid overlords in Bukhara in the late 10th century. And the Ghazabids, in turn, famously plunder parts of Western and Northwestern India, including the Punjab and Gujarat. That plunder was in turn used to expand the Ghazabid state across the Iranian plateau. But most importantly, the most famous sultan of the Ghazabids, Mahmud of Ghazni, vigorously patronized Persian literature. Like many other sultans of this era, in fact, he was the first one to use the title of sultan. He attracted to his court many, many poets, only the most famous of whom would include Farukhi Sistani, Unsuri, Manuchehri, and most famously of all, perhaps, Ferdowsi. And he established the idea of a poet laureate. It's said that everywhere Mahmud went, he brought with him a large number of poets. So Ferdowsi writes the Shahnameh, the book, so-called Book of Kings, which is extremely important. His statue you see here in Tehran is one of the few statues to survive the Islamic Revolution in Iran of 1979, largely because Ferdowsi is revered as having, in a sense, more than anyone else anyway, rescued Persian from being overwhelmed by Arabic. The Book of Kings uses about 95% of vocabulary is Persian, is New Persian. And of course, this text, the Shahnameh, patronized by Mahmud of Ghazni, would be read, it would be imitated, argued about by peoples across a huge span of territory, from the Balkans through Bengal, from Central Asia, ultimately across India. And it has been argued that this work, the Shahnameh, was the foundational act and text of the Persianate world, since it was through this text that millions of people inhabiting this vast domain could imagine themselves as being connected. And an excellent example of this is how Ferdowsi treated none other than Alexander the Great, who in fact conquered Persia, but nonetheless became in Ferdowsi's hands a Persian hero. This is an extraordinary thing. Alexander, of course, had already conquered territories from Greece all the way to India, thereby bringing a large part of the known world into a single polity. So he was understood as a universal king. But in Ferdowsi's hands, he was also a Persian king, since Ferdowsi saw him as the secret son of a Persian princess born of the Persian emperor Darius the Great. And even before Ferdowsi's time, Muslims had identified Alexander with this enigmatic figure in the Quran called the Zulqarnain, or he of two horns, who traversed the world from east to west, thwarting the forces of evil. So this kind of identification was helped by early Greek coins, which in fact depicted Alexander, you see it here on the screen, wearing ram's horns. So all this means that Alexander was not only a universal king, and not only a Persian king, but also a quasi-messianic figure in the hands of not only Ferdowsi, but then subsequent poets had their own versions of Alexander. So the Alexander myth kind of grew in epic literature, in popular romance literature, and ultimately in folklore. All of which is to say that by the 14th and 15th century, we can speak of a Persian canon of poets, historians, writers of politics, romance literature, and so forth. The names you see here are simply among the most famous, who by the 14th and 15th century, their works were read across the Persian-speaking world. And this canon informed people a great range of topics, ranging from kingship to governance, courtly etiquette, proper social comportment, Sufi piety, art, architecture, all of these things could be included in them. And what's interesting about it is where these works were produced. Here we have, for example, Ganja in present-day Azerbaijan in the Caucasus. This is where Nizami, the great storyteller, author of popular stories, lived, wrote the Leli Majnun, the Sikandar-Nama. He himself wrote a very important epic about Alexander. And these stories traveled all over the Persian-speaking world. At the same time, on the other end, in Lahore, Hujwiri, very important Sufi poet, compiled one of the earliest treatises of Sufism in the Punjab. Not much later, Amir Khosrow in Delhi is writing both poetry and histories, which became normative across the Persian-speaking world. And far to the west in Anatolia, we have the great mystic poet Rumi, driven from Afghanistan, ultimately into Western, central Anatolia and Konya. And my point here being that all these places illustrate the diffusion of Persian writers very far from the original site of New Persian's incubation in Bukhara in Central Asia. And so when we think about the growth of the Persian world, then, we can, I think, identify a number of factors that explain this phenomenon. One is simply the patronage of states that were themselves expanding. So we have, for example, the Ghaznavids I mentioned before. They are patronizing Persian literature, and their governors, of course, are posted across the Iranian plateau in Central Asia, as well as extending into the Punjab. And after them, in fact, overthrowing the Ghaznavids are the Seljuk Turks, another very large confederation. And as they move from Central Asia, the heartland, across the Iranian plateau into Caucasus, Anatolia, across Iraq, and so forth, they are not only converting to Sunni Islam, but they are becoming heavily Persianized to the extent that their sultans, the Seljuk sultans, adopt Persian titles like Khosrow and Kubad and so forth. They issue coins showing the lion and sun, ancient symbol of Iranian kingship. They trace their origins not to Turkish heroes in Central Asia, but to the kings of ancient Persia. And most importantly, they adopted Persian as the language of administration. So just as the Arabs had used the skills of Sasanian Persian writers for their bureaucracy, so also the Seljuks would use Persian administrators for the same purpose. Then you have the migration, the factor of migration. And here, the big story, of course, is the eruption of the Mughal Empire in the early 13th century. Genghis Khan himself coming all the way from Mongolia to the area around Bukhara, followed by decades of Mongol invasions, extending, as you see in the map, across all of Central Asia, into Russia, across the Middle East, into Eastern Europe. And this drives thousands, hundreds of thousands of those who had the means to move. It drives them out seeking refuge in other areas. And one of these refuge areas, one of the few large Islamic states left after the Mongols did their business, was the Delhi Sultanate. So Delhi becomes a refuge area for traumatized urban Turks, Persianized Turks, who had already been Persianized, because that had already happened over the previous several generations. And of course, Delhi Sultanate is needing administrators. And these administrators, these Turks, needed a place to go, fleeing the Mongols. So there's an enormous growth of Delhi. We see this alone in the expansion of the famous the Qutub Mosque in southwestern Delhi today, as it itself was physically expanded to accommodate this larger population of Turks. So migration is a major factor here. And it explains why it is then that these former frontier zones of the Persian-speaking world now become sites of production in their own right. The Iranian plateau, having been conquered by the Mongols, of course, it's also producing Persian literature, but I'm drawing attention to these frontier zones, many of which were areas where Persianized Turks had fled, fleeing the Mongols. I mentioned Rumi already in Konya, in Anatolia. The same is true for the Deccan Plateau in India, as far as Gaur in Bengal. All these areas were refuge areas. And then we have emulation, the Persianate world expanding simply by imitation. People who wanted to get on board this cosmopolitan culture, much in the same way that we can think of, blue jeans or Coca-Cola as moving across the world not by imposition, not by conquest, simply by emulation. And this is something which I think is probably the most important and the most interesting aspect of how the Persianate world expanded, especially into India. And we see this seen in several respects. Take, for example, the idea of justice. Well, from the 11th century on, when the Abbasid Caliphate was formed in the 8th century, but especially from the 11th century, as that same caliphate became weakened, there emerged a de facto separation of church and state, if you will. The capital of Baghdad, of course, remained very much the heartland of the caliph, who was recognized as the source of religious legitimacy, Islamic jurisprudence, and so forth. Whereas the sultans, these upstart sultans on the fringes of the Abbasid Empire, like Khorasan, like Central Asia, many of whom acquired power simply by brute force, they were recognized as holding de facto effective political power. So there's a separation between religion and politics, and the legitimizing force for these new sultans oftentimes was the principle of justice, an idea that had been inherited all the way back from ancient Mesopotamia, ultimately through the Sasanians, Persians, and now these new states in Central Asia. And the idea of justice gets articulated in a number of forms, especially the so-called Mura for Princes literature, which became popular in the 11th and 12th centuries. We find it expressed in this succinct statement by one important writer, Ibn Balkhi, who says, "There is no kingdom without an army, no army without wealth, no wealth without material prosperity, and no material prosperity without justice." And what's interesting about this formula is not only that it integrates economics with power, with morality, but also, in addition to being a coherent ideology, there's no mention here of God. There's nothing about religion. What's central to it is the idea of justice. So that in this Persianate theorization of power and politics, justice is in a sense placed above piety. The leading historian of the Delhi Sultanate in the 14th century, Ziauddin Barni, stated that whereas any country could flourish under a non-Muslim ruler so long as he was just, no country ruled by a Muslim would flourish if that person were unjust. So this idea of justice being central to Persianate understandings of power and of politics is something which is not only found in places like the Delhi Sultanate, ruled by Muslims, but even in areas far from any Muslim sultanate or state. Take, for example, the Kakatiya Hindu dynasty, which is, you see it here on the map, southeast of the Delhi Sultanate, where in the 12th or early 13th century, the Telugu poet Badena has this remarkable proverb: to acquire wealth, make the people prosper. To make the people prosper, justice is the means. O Kirti Narayana, they say that justice is the treasury of kings. So if we compare Ibn Balkhi with Badena, writing only several generations later, perhaps, we see how wealth, prosperity, and justice are all linked together in an integrated ideology. And the important point I'm making here is that these ideas are now moving beyond parts of the world that were actually ruled by Muslim states, sultanates. At the same time, in one of those sultanates, in Delhi itself, we have the ruler Iltutmish issuing coins with the single word adl, which means justice. Or to move further down time, by the 16th and 17th century, in the Mughal period, Shah Jahan builds in Shah Jahanabad, Old Delhi, in the palace. The scales of justice are prominently displayed here. So the idea of justice is something, obviously, which is central to Persianate ruling ideology and was imitated, obviously, by non-Muslims, people very far from these kinds of states. We also find the very word sultan as something that was picked up by non-Muslim rulers in India, simply because it was identified as the most powerful title that one could possibly find or think of. And indeed, one of the founders of this great empire of South India, Vijayanagara, styled himself the Sultan of Indian kings, the Hindu Raya Sultana. The word was simply assimilated into Telugu. And importantly, not only he, but also subsequent rulers of Vijayanagara use the word Sultan, not just Hindu Raya Sultana, but Sultan alone, in addition to their Sanskrit epithets for themselves. So the idea of the Sultan is another one of these things which moves across space dramatically as part and parcel of Persianate ruling ideology. And of course, architecture similarly reflects this same kind of thing. If we look again at Vijayanagara, where we have down by the river, temples, sacred center, depicted in very much classical South Indian architectural styles. But moving south to the royal center, where the palaces are located, here were these sultans among Indian kings, which is to say the rulers of Vijayanagara, built their own palaces and important government buildings, following classic dictates of Persianate architectural styles: domes, vaulted aisles, arches, and so forth. Clearly, they wanted to be seen as participating in this broader, cosmopolitan, sophisticated, trans-regional culture. And using this kind of architecture is one of the most visible ways by which they could do that. Indeed, they even went so far as to build a hall of 100 columns. We don't see the whole columns here, they don't remain, but we see the column bases. And this is a sketch of what the 100-column hall actually looked like, built in the 14th century. And its ultimate roots take us all the way back to the 6th century BC in Persepolis, Iran, where the empire of Darius the Great, Cyrus the Great, and others similarly had their throne room of a hall of 100 columns. So here we have an almost direct transmission of an ancient Persian conception of political space transferred to South India, and specifically in the Vijayanagara Empire. And in attire, clothing, the same thing happens. We see here, for example, in this miniature painting from 17th century Bijapur, Deccani warriors wearing what was known in Telugu as a kulai, a Telugu word that assimilated the Persian word kola, which simply means headgear or even a crown, as well as the Persian word or Perso-Arabic word kaba, which means a tunic. These items of clothing were worn in the northern part of the Deccan by Muslim rulers, but they were also worn in Vijayanagara. We see from this wall painting the kolai, or the kola, and the kaba, the tunic and the headgear, both of which again illustrate the apparent desire of the ruling class of Vijayanagara to be seen as participating in this broader Persianate world. And indeed, the most renowned ruler of Vijayanagara, Krishnaraya, depicted himself in this courtyard wearing a kulai while relaxing on a throne. So in all these ways, we can see how Persian styles were emulated across a broad swath of territory. And a last means that I want to mention very quickly here is the diffusion through Persian models of literature being picked up by what has been called cosmopolitan vernaculars. In other words, non-Persian languages that use Persian styles of poetry, styles of grammar even, and incorporate them in their own literary traditions. This happens in the case of Turkish, many dialects of Turkish, of Hindi, of Urdu, of Deccani in South, the Deccan Plateau, and as far east as Malay in Southeast Asia. And I'll simply illustrate how this works by taking one text, which I think serves to demonstrate how, although Persian language itself was not moving across space, Persian texts and Persian models of literature were moving as these texts were translated into local languages, or as these local languages were themselves acquiring literary status, they looked to Persian as their models, again, to emulate. One example of that is a Persian tale that was probably originated in Gujarat in the 13th century. This is the Saif al-Muluk, which is a romance story of a hero named Saif al-Muluk, who is in a quest for his beloved. It's a classic story which can be seen as a parable of Sufism itself, where the individual is searching for God. Well, this Persian text was ultimately moved out of India north all the way to the Uzbek court in Central Asia, in Bukhara, where we find a Turkish version of this, actually a Chagatai dialect of Turkish. A versified version of the Saif al-Muluk appears there. Then when Babur conquers India in the early 1500s, he takes this same text with him to Delhi, where both it and its original Persian version are copied and used. These copies are then transmitted to the Deccan as far as Golconda, where the same story emerges in Deccani Urdu, which is one of the forerunners of modern North Indian Urdu. And this Deccani version of the tale was then from South India transmitted across the Bay of Bengal to the Bengali-speaking part of what is now Burma. So we get a Bengali version of the Saif al-Muluk appearing there. And this is only 10 years after it has appeared already in Golconda in the Deccan. So by now we've seen it emerging in the original Persian version, then in Uzbek Turkish, then from Delhi down to the Deccan where it emerges in Deccani, then finally into Bengali. And then in 1685, a member of a diplomatic mission from the Iranian Shah in Isfahan here goes to the court of Siam in Southeast Asia. And while he was sailing around Sumatra, the island of Sumatra, he found a place, he heard this same story identified as the place where the hero, Saif al-Muluk, had actually found the beloved. So the story of the Saif al-Muluk had already entered the Malay tradition in the 17th century. My point here being that the Persianate world was not only built on the scaffolding of the language of administration, which of course it was ever since Akbar made it the official language in the Mughal Empire in the late 1500s, but also it's the language that inhabits a subjective zone of people's collective imagination, where all these different peoples, even though they're not speaking Persian, are imagining the same Persian story, this story of Saif al-Muluk, in this case, extending all the way from Isfahan to Sumatra. So to conclude this talk, let me just say a few words about the collapse of this Persianate world. And this occurs with colonial intrusions in 19th century, across 19th century Asia, and the reactions to those intrusions, namely the assimilation of nationalist ideas among both Iranians and in India. And when this happens, the rise of nationalism in both India and the Iranian plateau effectively snapped a very important bridge between Iran and India. And in particular, what happens in Iran is that Ferdowsi, this remarkable author of the Shahnameh that I discussed a moment ago, becomes nationalized by the Shah of Iran, Reza Shah Pahlavi, in the 1920s and early 30s, when he builds this tomb of Ferdowsi outside of Mashhad. And what's striking about this tomb is that architecturally, it's directly imitating the actual tomb of Cyrus the Great in southern Iran, near Shiraz. And so effectively what's happening here is that Ferdowsi has become nationalized by the nation state of Iran. So what you've done is you've conflated 4th century BC Persia of Cyrus with the 11th century Khorasan, which was where Ferdowsi actually lived, with 20th century modern Iran. They've all been squashed together. And this image of these two structures you're looking at here, I think capture the idea of how the nation state has appropriated for itself this great Persian language poet. But not only him, but all these other poets that were identified with this larger world are now kind of assimilated as part of the Iranian nation. This is part of the story, I think, that tells us to the decline of the Persianate world. And I'll simply end by the remark here that my own book was, well, I stopped it in 1765, which was totally an arbitrary date, because Penguin had asked me to write a history of the second of 3 volumes of India. And the modern period was associated with the coming of the British. So I simply picked out of the year 1765, that being the date of the Divani of Bengal, when the finance of this very important Mughal province was handed over to the East India Company. But one could have used any other number of dates. Clearly, Persianate culture extended well beyond 1765, but for practical purposes, I simply had to choose that date. But why the idea of Persianate has taken off in modern discourse, I think is fascinating. The very fact that the Islamic Revolution occurred in 1979 meant that many scholars of Persian could no longer go back to Iran. But they could go to those parts of the Persianate world where Persian had flourished. And that rediscovery, in a sense, of this broader Persianate world made it possible for the word Persianate itself to become common in academic discourse. And that, I think, is one of the major reasons that the word Persianate has really taken life in the last 10 or 20 years. So with that, I will stop and thank you all for listening, and we'll eventually be happy to take questions. I'll also stop my screen share right there. Yeah.
Richard, that was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. What I'm going to do is to narrow the focus considerably, and I'm going to look at what happened to Persianate India after about 1765, which is where you stop. I want to continue, but I'm looking, as I say, at a much smaller area than you've done. So what I've put up on the screen, first of all, is actually, I've pinched this map from Niall Green's book on the Persianate Age, because it looks at the places I want to talk briefly about. I have to say, first of all, for those of you who know Bengal, if you look at Calcutta and Murshidabad, I can assure you that Pandwa isn't in between them. It really isn't. I've been there, trust me. So that's wrong. But what this map does show is, first of all, Murshidabad and Lucknow, and then we go down to Hyderabad. And these are three provinces, for want of a better word, that I want to talk about briefly, because these were, in a way, successor states to the Mughals. As the Mughal Empire collapsed, you get these spin-offs, the provinces spinning off, rather like sort of a satellite, which is sort of spinning out stars around it. So within a very brief period of about 4 years, in the 1720s, you get a spin-off states of Murshidabad, which is the capital of Bengal. You get Awadh, the capital is Lucknow, and you get the state of Hyderabad. And all three of them, they're all Muslim provinces. And in every case, the governors decide to break away from the Mughal Empire, which is on its way out. They can see that. And it's interesting that all three governors of these provinces were actually not native to the places that they finally took over. And it's something to do with the energy of incomers, of immigrants, that they make these provinces their own. So looking at about 1720, you've suddenly got the collapse of the power of the emperor. Obviously, it didn't collapse immediately, and people still paid tribute to the emperor. But this, I think, was really the start of the breakup of the Mughal Empire. And with it, of course, you wonder, well, what happened to the Persianate culture, which by the mid-19th century was, I'm afraid, almost vanished. All these places you've talked about, it suddenly seemed to disappear. So I wanted to look at some of the reasons why. And Persianate, of course, as you pointed out, doesn't just mean language, it means other things like culture and knowledge. So I wanted to try and explore briefly how we see it, particularly in these three provinces of Bengal, Hyderabad, and Awadh, but also to see what happened when the East India Company came in. And you've mentioned this briefly, the Indian Empire. So we get the East India Company coming in around the coast, Surat, which you can see there, round to Madras, Chennai now, and particularly in Calcutta. And I'm very interested in the Calcutta Bengal areas. So the company are coming in, at first they're coming in as traders, and they're coming in quite hesitantly, and they're making sure that they actually get permission from the emperor or the local governors to trade. They're not just marching in, and it's not through conquest. They want to make money. They want to trade. And it's only later, after about 1765, as you pointed out, that they start to become rulers. They take over the Divani of Bengal, which means that they're taking over the administration and collecting land revenues. So your date, although you said was arbitrary, is actually quite significant. So what did the East India Company do when they came in and found a Persianate culture? Well, they had to learn Persian. And in fact, Persian was the official language of the East India Company until the 1830s. And it was widely used, interestingly enough, when Warren Hastings was negotiating with the Maratha leader, Scindia. He sent a Persian-speaking man from Awadh to negotiate, and they were negotiating in Persian, which I thought was quite interesting. And you also get Persian very, very widely used. The language is widely used at this period in the early 19th century. So let's move on. Printing presses. Now, the press is a way of obviously conveying the Persian language, other languages as well. And you get printing presses coming into India about the 1820s. They're brought in by the Europeans, not just the English, of course, but the French as well. And at first it's complicated because you actually need to typeset, you need to cast the Persian letters in lead, and then you have to typeset the whole thing. This was obviously quite a tedious process, particularly for people who may not have known Persian. It continued for about 30 years, and then the lithographic press came in, and this meant that you could get the calligraphers writing Persian as they would have done on manuscripts, and it can be transferred to printing. So as soon as you get this, you get a lot of Persian manuscripts, which were only known to an elite number, but they're much more widely disseminated. So the printing press is actually disseminating Persian. Next slide, please. And obviously Persian survived and adapted. And this is a particularly nice example of what's called Sabaki Hindi. And it's a kind of Persianized Hindi, more like Urdu actually, with a lot of Persianized words. And this was very, very common. And this particular example is interesting because it's written by a Frenchman, Claude Martin, and I'm not going to say very much about him because I'm talking about him in January, but it's written by Claude Martin to his Indian servants who are on an estate a few miles away. And the servants are both Muslim and Hindu. And it's interesting that Martin has no doubt that his servants, who are not menials, but they're still servants, will be able to understand this and will be able to appreciate it. So I think that's quite a good example of how Persian was actually used among ordinary people in North India. And letters, we also have, apart from Claude Martin's letters in Persian, we have Antoine Pollier's letters. He was another Frenchman, and his letters are written in a particular style called Persian Insha, and this is very formulaic. It starts off with all kinds of formal addresses. If you've ever read these in translation, letters to rulers, the introduction, the names take up about half the page, and it was a particular kind of formulaic way of talking and addressing people. It seems terribly ornate to us today, but nevertheless, this is what is used. Next, please. And this is interesting because it was Salatin, and it's a history of Bengal, which was written in Persian, and it was actually commissioned by an Englishman, George Udney. He was the resident in Malda, which is quite far north in Bengal, and he asked to have the history of Bengal written down for him, and it wasn't in fact translated until 1902. The original version was written in 1788, and in fact we can tell that it's a chronogram. You probably know that Urdu letters have their own numerical values, and once Rizazu Salatin is added up, it comes to 1788. So we know when it was written and translated. So a simple example of Persian being used in Bengal. The way to tell the history of Bengal is in Persian. Next, please. And I wanted to look briefly at poetry. You have Richard mentioned the great poets, the really great guys like Rumi. And this is a kind of local example. These are couplets by Mir Taqi Mir, actually one of my favorite authors. And when I was reading Urdu at university, we had to study him. It's lovely stuff. And the reason I chose the first one was that he's showing that poetry, Persianized poetry, is all over India. It's not just in North India, as he says, it's in the Deccan too. And people valued poetry so much that they would have couplets written, beautifully written by calligraphers, and actually take these to their friends. You know, perhaps as we would take a bottle of wine today, they would take a poem, a beautifully written poem. And the second couplet here is a particular favorite of mine. A lot of Mir's poetry is symbolic. It's about the relationship to God, and God is often seen as a beautiful but cruel woman. And he's saying here, you know, whatever happens, she's in command. I'm very fond of Mir's poetry, and in fact, it's interesting that he came from Delhi, and he lived a very, very long life. He was 87 when he died. He died in Lucknow. He never actually took to Lucknow as he did to Delhi. He considered Delhi was really the center of the universe, and for a long time it actually was, of the Persianate universe. But nevertheless, he had to move for political reasons, and he's very much revered today. And what you do find, obviously, in Persianate poetry are familiar images. You get the nightingale, the bulbul, the roses, the candles, the moon, wine, and you also get puns and double meanings. So it's very, very intricate. It is perhaps stylized, if you like, but nevertheless, very, very pleasing to read. Next, please. And I just wanted to say, before we leave language, I'm going to go on to knowledge. What was happening in the English-speaking community? Well, in 1851, you get A Century of Persian Ghazals, and it's a translation by Nathaniel Bland. And interestingly, what he says is that many of the manuscripts from which he took these poems were actually in the library of the East India House in London. So you're getting Persian manuscripts transferred now to England. And I'll say a little bit later on about Persianate age in England. But what I wanted to do was to look very briefly at knowledge. And I think you touched very briefly on this, Richard, astronomy. And this is the observatory at Jaipur, which was put up in 1724 by the Raja Jai Singh. And it's interesting that all of these amazing shapes actually have Sanskrit names. It also contains the largest stone sundial in the world. Next, please. And bearing that in mind, it's interesting to look at this observatory, which was built in about 1420. It only survived for a very short time, for about 30 years, and then it disappeared completely and wasn't found until the beginning of the 20th century. But it was built by Ulugh Beg, who was a grandson of Timur, the great Tamburlaine. And it is absolutely amazing. And I think it's very difficult to appreciate, certainly Persianate India in the colonial period and the pre-colonial period, unless you've actually traveled to places like Bukhara and Samarkand. Once you get there, you see how Mughal India actually fits in, actually fulfills the promise of coming from these places. It's interesting that the three provinces I was talking about all seem to vie for the position of successor to the Mughal Empire. They jostled for position, and so they were carrying on things that came from the empire, from the emperor, and the customs and habits, none of them terribly successfully, and none of them existed for that long. But it's this idea of succession, of tradition, of heritage, and you do see that very, very clearly once you're in places like Samarkand and Bukhara. As I said, it all makes sense once you're there. Next, please. And now looking at architecture, as you mentioned, this is a very, very interesting indicator. And I think you're right that architects, art historians tend to be divorced from social historians, anthropologists. What I'm trying to do in my next book is actually blend these together. So we'll see how successful it is. But this is Murshidabad, and the long low building to the left is the Imambara. This is the largest imambara in India. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's particularly associated with the Shia religion, which of course is strongest in Iran. And it's a place of commemoration. You can have burials within imambaras, so its chief function is really as a kind of huge religious community hall to be used on special occasions. Next, please. And this is inside an imambara, and interestingly enough, this is actually in Calcutta. I put this in because it's fairly typical. It's got a huge number of lights, candles, the arches. It's also got burials here. And in fact, it is the burial place of Wajid Ali Shah, who was the last king of Awadh, and we'll meet him again shortly. But this shows you what an imambara is like inside. This is actually quite a small one. So you can imagine how gorgeous the large imambara at Murshidabad is. Next, please. And this person, I had to put him in because it's a wonderful photograph, but it also, I think, illustrates something of what I was saying about customs. It's the Emir of Bukhara, and it is the last Emir. And what he's doing is wearing an absolutely gorgeous dress, and this is called a kilat. These were robes of honor, if you like, which were presented by rulers to mark special occasions. If you were having a large durbar, a large get-together, you might present some of your officials with kilats. It's a mark of honor. And this is a very, very old tradition, actually goes back to Arab customs, but it seems so symbolic here. We find it time and time again that there's a ceremony and kilats are presented, but also presented to English people too. So it's not just among Muslims or among people in this particular kind of world. And I have to say that there are accounts of English people receiving these gorgeous robes of honor and then immediately turn around and selling them because they're actually worth quite a lot of money. And also what you get, you can't quite see it here, and in fact, he may not be wearing it, but you get little miniature paintings, little jeweled miniatures, like brooches, like cameos in a way. And this was very, very common, particularly among the Qajar Shahs in Iran, that you would give someone this little miniature as a mark of honor. And in some cases, you were not actually allowed to come into court unless you were wearing one of these. It was like an identity badge, but it's also the idea of a portable representation of a great man. Next, please. Now, you have to ask, did the early Europeans in the 18th century adopt what we could describe as Persianate culture? And I think the answer is to a large extent, yes. First of all, they had to learn Persian. They had to speak in Persian. Once you start speaking in a language, you almost unconsciously tend to adopt some of the things from that language. And this is a very clear representation. It's Antoine Pollier, who was a Frenchman, and he is sitting down in his rather fine house in Lucknow, and he is thoroughly imbued in the culture. He is watching a dance performance, Nautch, and it's believed that the three dancers are explaining to him the various moves and the various steps. In the background, you can see a fountain there and a little pavilion. And to his side, there's a hookah, which is very closely associated with Persianate culture, with rulers. And it was adopted widely by Europeans. By about the 1820s, it was considered rather a disgusting habit, rather as we see smoking today. But at this period, it was an essential prop, if you like, for an important person, for a noble. And there's just one more thing about Antoine Pollier. You notice his moustache, and this is based very, very closely on the moustaches worn by Persian nobles and particularly by the first rulers of Awadh, who themselves actually came from Naishapur in Persia. This droopy moustache, it had been phased out in about 50 years' time. But you see that Polly has not only adopted the dress and the manners and the hookah, but the moustache as well, and of course the turban. So I think you can say he's thoroughly Persianized. You also get the same thing to some extent in Hyderabad. And what happens is that the rulers, these Frenchmen and a number of Europeans as well, the mercenaries, were working for Indian rulers and they get Indian titles. For example, Pollier got the title of Arsalan-i-Jung, Lion of Battle. And this was a title given to him, just as General Raymond, the Frenchman working for the Nizam of Hyderabad, got a title too. So they're accepting part of the culture and they're quite happy to do so. So we shouldn't always see Europeans as going sort of brash, uncultured people. They had to learn Persian, obviously, and many of them adopted Persian culture and they adopted all kinds of things that they would not have done in Europe, like numerous wives. Next, please. I mentioned Wajid Ali Shah, and in fact, we saw his Imambara in Calcutta. And this is a portrait of him in old age. And he really was the last king in India, as I've said in my book. And what I like about him is that he never actually gave up. He insisted that people addressed him in Persian until the date of his death, which was 1887. He wrote in Persian. He probably couldn't understand English. I mean, he obviously spoke Urdu, but this insistence on keeping the Persian language. And he would write to Queen Victoria. He had absolutely no hesitation seeing Queen Victoria as one of his peers. And there are quite a number of his letters in beautiful stylized Persian in Windsor Castle. For example, when Prince Albert died, he sent Victoria a Taziatnama, which is a letter of condolence, and it was beautifully presented in a little silk and gold purse. And also, when Queen Victoria, her life was attempted about 6 times in her reign. There were assassination attempts, and after the last one in Windsor in 1882, Wajid Ali Shah sends her a Mahabbatnama, which is a friendly letter congratulating her on escaping from the assassin's bullet. So I like this chap. He, as I said, he never gave up. He was one of the last examples of the old Persianate through the Mughal culture in India. Next, please. This is a painting, a fairly modern painting. When I say modern, 1936, from Hyderabad, painted by a German artist. And it's not particularly clear, but what I wanted to show you was the durbas, the formal ceremony at the court, are still being held at this period in 1936. Hyderabad was the last province, if you like, to surrender after independence. It held out for a whole year after independence. It wasn't integrated into the new independent India until 1948. So it's very stiff and it's very ceremonial. And what you can't actually see in this painting are the African guards, the African cavalry outside. And it's a characteristic that both Awadh and Hyderabad made great use of African soldiers, perhaps bought originally as slaves by Arab traders. But I think when we're looking at these states, we actually have to consider Africans who became Muslims as part of this Persianate culture. Next, please. And I wanted finally to look at how it might have spread to England. We've already seen that there were translations of Persian ghazals. And Oxford actually started an Institute of Oriental Studies in the 16th century, But it's interesting that Persian was not then among the languages studied. They were looking at Arabic and Hebrew, and these were considered the sort of pure Semitic languages. Persian was considered in a way quite soft, quite frivolous, possibly because it was the lingua franca. It didn't appear then to have a serious root. So Persian came rather late to Oxford. But then we have to look, as Richard said, at William Jones and his Persian grammar, written in 1771. And interestingly enough, this was quite heavily criticized by Mirza Abu Talib Khan, who came to England in the 1830s. And he said, well, Jones made an awful mess of it. And if I'm trying to teach people Persian, I have to unlearn everything they've learned from William Jones's grammar. But nevertheless, this was one of the first important books. Another interesting person was Sagar Ousley, and he wrote biographical notices of Persian poets. This was published in 1846. He was also a founder member of the Royal Asiatic Society in London, and he set up the Oriental Translation Committee, and part of their remit, obviously, was to translate literature from Persian. And interestingly enough, Persian was being used on coins minted for the East India Company by Matthew Boulton of Soho, of the Soho Mint. And as early as 1786, Matthew Boulton was sending coins out to the company in Calcutta and Bombay with Persian inscriptions, usually the names of the governors and the date and the amount of money, 1 rupee, 1 sikha rupee, and English on the reverse. A huge number of Persian inscribed coins went out to India, I mean, a vast number. We've also got Persian being taught at Fort William College, set up by the East India Company in 1800. And in England, it's being taught at Haileybury, the East India College, and at Addiscombe. By about 1850, interest is waning because English has now become the official language of the East India Company. So it becomes rather an academic pleasure, rather as people would enjoy Latin poetry. You get the same kind of thing. It's losing its emphasis after the middle of the 19th century. Next, please. And this is the last slide, but I couldn't resist putting it in because for me, it's the last gasp, if you like, of Persianate culture. It's the Delhi Durbar of 1903, which was organized by Lord Curzon, the Viceroy. And it was the biggest and the best of the 3 Durbars. There was a huge tented city set up. And of course, tents were integral to many of the rulers, the Mughals, for example. They had great tented cities, and the hunting parties where you would travel around for 3 months of the year in tents, moving around a vast area. And I think we probably don't recognize that enough, that it was a nomadic society. So anyway, you've got tents set up for the Delhi Durbar, you've got fireworks, a Durbar medal is struck, and Curzon himself arrives on an elephant. What could be more regal, more Mughal than that? And you notice the ceremonial chata right at the top, the umbrella, a sign of royalty. This together with the peacock fan symbolizes Mughal royalty. And you might ask if the East India Company, and in fact the British Raj, saw themselves as successors to the Mughals. And I think the answer is probably not. This seemed to be the thinking earlier on. I don't think this is the case. I think it was a new rule. It was a new, what would I say? A new government, obviously. And this is the very last gasp, I think. Interestingly enough, George V and Queen Mary, who attended, actually gave a darshan, and this means a viewing. It's when the public can actually see the royalty. there weren't any kilats. As far as I can tell, there was no ceremonial presentation of robes. But I think I will leave you with this image of the last gasp, perhaps, of Persianate culture in India. Thank you.
Rosie, thank you so much. I've heard Richard many times now because his exposition really was so revelatory for me, and I know I'm going to watch and rewatch the recording of your talk. I hope you found that as rewarding to put together as I, for one, found it to be listening and viewing. Richard, I was going to ask each of you whether you had any questions about each other's ideas or presentations. So Richard, I'll give Rosie a time to sort of swallow and lubricate her vocal cords before asking you a question. So I'll ask you to think of a question you might want to ask Rosie first. Oops. Well, you seem to be muted, so I'll have to ask you to unmute. Let me just see if I can do it. We seem to have lost your sound.
You can hear me, can you? Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yes.
yes,
Okay.
yes.
Okay. All right, here we go.
Mm.
Technology.
Mhm.
Well, I just want to thank you, Rosie, for giving such a great sequel to what I was trying to do in kind of seeing how these two worlds overlapped and merged in so many respects. And you know, and I love this last image of yours where you have Lord Curzon up there on his elephant with the chatra and all these other symbols of royalty, which you rightly point out, no matter what the British might have said, they clearly are seeing themselves or projecting themselves as successors to the Mughals. And of course, the Mughals themselves had inherited so many indigenous Indian associations, including the elephant itself, obviously. But I found that fascinating. I also found fascinating your discussion of Wajid Ali Shah insisting on being addressed in Persian all the way down to his death in 1887. And I was wondering whether that was still happening in anywhere else in India, or whether he really was the last person to continue using Persian, at least in that sense, because I'm obviously, you know, Persian language was still being used in informal settings. And I just have to recite one point here, that when I first went to India, doing my research in 1969, 1970, I recall a Khatri Hindu migrant from the Punjab invited me for supper in Hyderabad, after which he sat on a takht, a raised platform, and recited the poetry of Hafez. And I was just struck by how that tradition continued informally. You rightly pointed to how in houses, ruling houses, Lucknow and elsewhere, continued this tradition. But I just wanted to add that in an informal sense, all the way down to the 1960s and 70s, when I was in Hyderabad, you still found that kind of tradition of recitation of Persian poetry occurring. So yes, I just wanted to congratulate you on your own talk and ask you whether you think that this tradition might have been continued in other courts apart from Lucknow in the late 19th century.
Not as far as I can tell. In Hyderabad, they're obviously writing in English to the viceroys and the governors, but I think it was only Wajid Ali Shah who actually held out and would insist on being addressed in Persian. As I said, he didn't speak English, but he certainly spoke local languages, Urdu, and we know he enjoyed Bengali plays and music, so I'm pretty sure he picked up Bengali as well. But there's something quite stubborn about him adhering to these very formal Persian letters. It's not colloquial Persian either. It's the full range of, you know, pages of introduction and similes and odd formal phrases. That's what I liked about him. Whether I don't think anybody else was actually writing at this point, and he died in 1887. I'd be very surprised if anybody else was, because it also meant that you had to have translators. You had to have people who could translate his letters too.
That's right. Yeah.
And Rosie, did you have any questions you wanted to put to Richard?
No. What I want to do is to watch this again and really absorb what he said. It's just so interesting. It really is, especially bringing it up to date with that Pahlavi tomb, 1924.
Oh yes, yeah.
Absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
And that still survives today, does it?
Oh yes. I've seen it.
Yes.
I've seen both the tomb of Cyrus and the tomb of Ferdowsi, and it's so striking that and so obvious that the Pahlavi Shah, Reza Shah, was trying to assimilate Ferdowsi into the Iranian nation state. Really captures that visually. Yeah.
Well, I'm looking at questions that have been keyed into the chat box, and the first one I have here is for Richard. In fact, there's another question coming in, which I'll get onto in a moment. But the first question is, how have Hindu reviewers reacted to your portrait of Persianate India's cultural richness in the current context of Islamophobia and what Shashi Tharoor recently called a retreat from pluralism and the erasure of long-standing syncretic cultural traditions? Has your book been banned or burned?
Well, I hope not. At least I'm not aware of it. I'll say that. But so far as published reviews are concerned, I can say that thus far, knocking on wood, crossing fingers here, so far the reviews have been very satisfyingly positive in general. So I cannot say that there's been anything like a kind of a Hindu response that has been on the whole negative. And I think the reason for that is that I'm really not talking about religion as much as I am talking about something much broader than that, but something which nonetheless pertains to religion, but in a more indirect, muted way than the more familiar notion of a frontal clash between Islam and Hinduism. So many textbooks exist and have been around for decades, portraying this long middle period as one of a kind of a centralized sacred Hindu zone being assaulted and undermined by a violent outside Muslim force. And that caricature, and I believe it is a caricature, is one that you rightly point out has been kind of absorbed in contemporary politics today. But I think by emphasizing the Persianate world and the Sanskrit world, as opposed to Muslim and Hindu, I've been able to broaden the lens, hopefully, somewhat, to talk about what I think are really much more important issues. And I'll simply cite one point here, and that is that when the Turks first conquered North India, we're going back to the Ghaznavids and the Ghurids in the 13th century, Sanskrit texts referring to these outsiders did not call them Muslims. They used the word Turushka, which is simply a Sanskrit version of the word Turk. So I think it's very significant that the Hindus of contemporary North India and later on South India did not view these outsiders in terms of religion, but rather as an outside ethnic group, just like there were other ethnic groups within India. And I think that point is one of many points that one needs to take into account when you try to reconstruct this long period of India's history. And I think it's really, frankly, with examples of that sort, that we can say that it's more honest, I think, to see Indian histories in this period as one of a confluence, a meeting point of two literary traditions, which have a broad range of ramifications, including everything from music, cuisine, to clothing, and all the rest of it, as well as, of course, religion. So to answer the question, I thus far have not been attacked, at least to my knowledge, by the Hindutva crowd. And I think it's because this, as I say, the use of Persianate, I think, strikes a chord where everyone kind of recognizes that, yes, we have all these Persian words for kebabs and biryanis and other, Indian cuisine and Indian music. And so I hopefully my book will kind of awaken people to something they already perhaps knew but did not recognize.
Well, before going to another question to you, I'll give you a chance to rest and take a question here that's directed to Rosie. It is, when and why, if they did so, did British officials start seeing Persian culture as inferior? Did they take their lead from the top, for example, Wellesley, or was it because as more British went to India, British ways of doing things became more prevalent?
I'm not sure that there was actually a revulsion against Persianate culture. I mean, certainly a liking for it was very, very strong in the 18th century, as we've seen. I think it would be more honest to say it just faded away. All right, there were people who still valued Persian poetry, for example, Persian languages, as we've seen. And it's interesting that there seems to be a resurgence today of people at universities wanting to study Persian studies and the Persian languages. If you look at UCAS, there are quite a number of universities offering Persian studies. So I wouldn't say there was a revulsion against it, rather that it just faded out of consciousness. Once it was no longer the official language, then obviously it just wasn't so important. But of course, a lot of things continued, as we've seen in the Durbar. I mean, that looks pretty Persianate to me.
Question here for Richard. To what extent did Persian traditions of writing history influence contemporary and successor Indian regional priorities in the writing of history in Indian languages?
Are you referring to how the British began writing India's history and their use of Persian chronicles? Or are you talking about vernacular histories written today?
Well, I don't know, because I just read out the question, so possibly the questioner might like to expand on that, but it's just, to what extent did Persian traditions of writing history influence contemporary and successor Indian regional priorities in the writing of history in Indian languages?
I would say this, that, really ever since the early 13th century, Persian chronicles became the fundamental scaffolding for subsequent colonial rulers in the 18th century, 19th century, to reconstruct India's history. The chronicles were, for the most part, patronized by ruling authorities in various Persianate courts across India. But the idea of a chronologically based history beginning with, a founding ruler or a patron of some sort, and continuing into later times, the idea of a chronologically fact-based history was something that did appeal to the British colonial rulers as being India's real history, whereas other kinds of non-Persian texts were largely dismissed as not really as being real history at all. So there is a sense in which I think when you come to William Jones and other early colonial writers, when they saw the edifice of Persian literature and chronicle writing, there was a certain recognition that, aha, this is the real thing. So early colonial historiography of India relied very heavily on Persian chronicles, almost exclusively on Persian chronicles. And it is only now, in recent decades, that historians of India are becoming aware of the vast amount of vernacular Indian languages which need to be incorporated into our understanding of Indian history, even though they were not proper chronicles as we think of them. There's an enormous variety of genres, epigraphy of various sorts, and indeed even architecture that can be used to reconstruct the history. So I would say, yes, Persian chronicles had an enormous influence in the way in which colonial and post-colonial historians have tried to reconstruct medieval Indian history. Without them, we would really be in very bad shape. I can say that.
Another question for you, Richard. It is, we have culture wars going on in the UK over the writing of history, and you have them in the US too. Yet in your account of Sanskrit and Persian cultures, there's no conflict. Is that because you haven't really noticed it, or?
Right. Well, I would say there is, I'm not sure the word conflict. I'll just give you a few examples of how this might be played out. You know, in the Mughal period, we have Rajput notables who have been absorbed into the imperial system as mansabdars under Akbar, who would say patronize a bridge or a monument of some sort, and there would be two inscriptions on them. One would be in Persian, where all the credit would go to Akbar or Jahangir or whoever the ruler was, whereas the sub-imperial patron, who was oftentimes a Rajput ruler of some sort, might omit the name of Akbar altogether and claim the whole thing for himself. So the language matters a lot, because the epigraph patronized by the Rajput would be written in Hindavi or some version of Rajasthani. And I'm not sure I'd call that conflict, but I would say that there are different registers that are operating between the writing of language in Persian versus writing in, say, Rajasthani. It has to do with who the patron was and where the credit was seen as properly going. So absolutely, one has to be aware of those different registers. But at the same time, and I didn't talk about this in the talk, there's an enormous amount of Persian vocabulary that comes into and is assimilated into these vernacular languages to an extraordinary degree. I mean, even today, modern Hindi consists of somewhere between 20 and 30% pure Persian vocabulary. The Indians are constantly using Persian words without necessarily knowing it. I first encountered this when I was in Bengal studying Bengali, and I was becoming aware of how so many Persian words have been assimilated into Bengali, but inflected by Bengali phonetics to the point that they don't sound Persian anymore. So what do we say that? There is this kind of unconscious assimilation that's taken place that I find so interesting. It is certainly not conflict, but there are these different registers, and certainly people were aware of them when they're using Persian versus non-Persian languages. Yes.
A question here for Rosie. It's about the difference between Urdu and Persian. How close were they? Was there a sort of higher version of Urdu, a courtly version that was quite close to Persian?
Interesting question. I'm not a linguist, so I'm not sure I'm able to answer this. I studied Urdu at London University, and I can read Persian, obviously, because it's more or less the same script. And I recognize probably about 20% of the words, and the others I can read, but I don't know what they mean. Language is an ever-changing thing. Certainly the Persian letters of Claude Martin that I showed, they were translated into English by a Persian scholar at Lucknow University, but I was able then to read them and to put them into perhaps more correct English. So it fluctuates. I wish I'd actually learned Persian as my subsidiary language instead of Hindi, but there you are, I didn't. It's a lovely language. Even not knowing it properly, I can still appreciate how beautiful it is, which is why I'm so keen on Urdu poetry of the 18th, 19th century.
Another question here, but a factual one for Richard, it is, why was India thought to be isolated from other cultures in view of Silk Road and Indian Ocean trade and invasions and raids from the north?
Well, the question, it really begs the question, who was thinking that it was ever isolated? I mean, I can only point to the objective reality when we look at things such as those you mentioned, the Silk Road, the trade routes, especially the vital trade routes connecting the horse trade of Central Asia with India, because India was totally dependent upon, Indian states were dependent upon cavalry. Spice trade, I mean, one could talk about both maritime and overland linkages between India and the rest of the world, so that objectively speaking, India was always connected with the rest of the world. It's only, I think, in recent decades where this idea that India had been always an autonomous sacred zone, where even, the Sanskrit language and is seen as something that was entirely cut off from the rest of the world. Whereas we know that that's not at all the case, that Sanskrit is part of the Indo-European family. William Jones had it right at the beginning when he guessed correctly that and saw these connections between Sanskrit and Persian and ultimately English. So I think what we're talking about here is a more recent effort to understand India as kind of a self-grown culture, Hindu culture to be more precise, whereas in reality, the objective facts would speak otherwise.
Well, questions seem to have paused here. So before anyone thinks of any more, you've both been so generous with your time. Actually, here comes another question, so I'll quickly ask it. It is, has there been any study, books or articles about identifying what and how much of Old Persian written material has been destroyed after 6050s AD? I'll just get that in before we end.
Right. Yeah, I'm not really an authority on Old Persian. I at one time I tried to work with Middle Persian, and you can see the connections there between Middle Persian and Modern Persian. But Old Persian is so far removed, I'm not in a position to really say how much has survived or in what form. But it's a great question. That's all I can say.
Well, before any more questions come in, I think I'll end the Q&A and proceed to thank you both very much for your time and your generosity in speaking to us tonight. I'm very much looking forward to viewing this recording again, and thank you, both of you. And I'm going to hit the clapping hands here. There we go. Brilliant, wonderful. Thank Thank you. Come again.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Organising it, Valerie. Thank you.
Pleasure. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Night.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye-bye.